Washington Talk, I'm Eun-jang Cho. After the first working-level talks, the United States and North Korea are working to lay the groundwork for the second summit. How can the U.S. best prepare for the second summit to bolster the chances of success?
We're determined to work towards achieving that. I believe that the end of February, we'll have another good marker along the way.
In the studio with me today, Dr. Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Cronin spent more than 3 decades in the U.S. government and think tanks. Also joining me today, Mr. Frank Jannuzi, President of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you.
Now, we've had the first working level meeting, and in the lead up to the second summit, how should we carry out the working level meetings? How frequently should the two sides meet?
As often as possible. I would like to see near continuous working level meetings. The two sides may even want to consider in the future the establishment of liaison offices to facilitate routine working level contacts. If this process is going to really gather momentum, the two sides need to be working through many, many details associated with the step-by-step process of learning about the North Korean nuclear program, accumulating the inventory of it, and then deciding how, step by step, to get rid of it. And so I hope that this first meeting that happened in Stockholm will be the first of many, and that the periodicity of these meetings will accelerate over time.
And what should be the focus and goal of the working level meetings?
Well, the goal should certainly be to make them routine, but the routine aspect of it needs to come in support of substance. So without the leaders agreeing on substantive steps that need to be taken, especially toward denuclearization from the United States perspective, there's nothing for the intermediate level to talk about meaningfully if their leaders will not agree. So it's important for the experts at the mid-level to talk about verification. How do we implement the agreement of the leaders? How do we measure it? How do we measure progress or the lack of progress? I think the specifics, the how-to question is critical at the mid-level.
And when it comes to deliverables, how much progress do we need to see in denuclearization?
Well, I think that Patrick's right. You know, the goals, especially in this next year or two period, need to be set by the top leaders. They need to give clear instructions. And so I think it's going to be up to them to decide how quickly, how aggressively the two nations can move toward the goal of denuclearization. I think most observers here in Washington would like to see this entire process accelerated. They'd like to see a freeze on fissile material production. They'd like to see inspectors into the country to begin to learn better about the history of the North Korean nuclear program. But I think that it's going to be entirely up to the top leaders to decide what those first steps are by the North toward denuclearization and what corresponding measures, as the North calls it, are required by the United States to reciprocate for those meaningful steps toward denuclearization. I couldn't tell you what those steps are going to be. The top leaders are going to have to decide.
Patrick, do you have any idea how much progress do you want to see in denuclearization?
I have a report out with Christine Lee in a couple of weeks that talk about the need for substantial steps by Kim Jong-un. But even with substantial steps forthcoming, they're going to have to be done in steps. And there's only so much that could be done in the next year or two. Nonetheless, at the second summit of Trump and Kim, talking about giving up the ICBM, giving up or allowing fissile material production to have a moratorium and cease production, looking at the erector launchers being sort of put under lock and key. Those are the kinds of specific steps that the leaders could nominally agree to. And then the big question, as Frank suggested, is what's the quid pro quo? What exactly are we giving Kim Jong-un? What will he accept as the quid pro quo for those kinds of steps?
And as for quid pro quo, isn't the red line for the United States to not give sanctions relief at this time when there's no progress in denuclearization? So what can we offer to North Korea?
Well, the complicating factor here is the United Nations Security Council resolutions make clear the kind of behavior by North Korea that is unacceptable and which has to be not just stopped but reversed in order to qualify for much of the sanctions relief that the North is seeking. So you're exactly right. The United States' hands are tied a little bit. I think what we're going to see if the North takes meaningful steps, like Patrick suggested, freezing fissile material production, allowing inspectors in, stopping missile production, what you'll see is a decision by the U.S. administration to take both some symbolic steps, such as possibly removing North Korea from the state list of sponsors of terrorism, as well as some limited financial steps that could consist of waiving U.S. sanctions on North-South interaction. It could consist of expanded humanitarian assistance, which would not be a step on sanctions. But I don't think you're going to see the Trump administration significantly roll back those UN sanctions until we see major, maybe even irreversible progress by the North toward denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. And Patrick, you mentioned about step-by-step process. And this week, Secretary Pompeo said that denuclearization is going to be a process that's going to take some time, and that the first step is the freeze of missile testing. Second step is the freeze of nuclear testing. And those two steps are continuing. That's what he said. And I was struck that he mentioned the word step. So do you think the Trump administration is now leaning more towards step-by-step process?
There's no doubt there's been an evolution in the negotiating strategy on the part of the Trump administration. But once you engage in diplomacy with North Korea, everything is potentially open for negotiation. And I think this is what we're seeing, some give on the part of the Trump administration. If you think about the domestic debate over 5 weeks of a shutdown here in the United States, the president and Nancy Pelosi, neither one wants to be seen as stepping down or stepping back and making the concession. Those are part of the democracy and the democratic process. Now put yourself in with an adversary like Kim Jong-un. President Trump cannot afford to be looking weak, and yet he is making some rational concessions. He's basically taking the hardline position that initially dominated the thinking, that is the Libya model of one step and it's all over, and then sanctions relief, to, okay, it's going to be more than one step. It's going to be several steps, and we're going to have to even think about ways to incentivize North Korea in the meantime without giving up major sanctions prematurely. And that's a judgment call.
Just to build on this sense of pragmatism that I think is growing inside the administration, even from the beginning, there was an acknowledgement by the United States that North Korea doesn't have to do everything before we do something. So there is an acknowledgement now that is much more explicit on the part of the Trump administration. Some form of sanctions relief and other measures will be necessary to keep momentum in this process. But it's going to have to come in response for meaningful steps by the North.
Mm-hmm. And there's been reporting that President Trump has overridden the concerns of his aides, including National Security Advisor Bolton. So do you think at this moment the hawkish views are losing ground within the administration?
Well, I wouldn't say the hawkish view is losing ground so much as to say that the president's style is that he will be the final arbiter of policy. He's the man who's making the policy at the end of the day. Whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, that's the style of the Trump administration. So the president is saying, look, I hear you, Special Representative Began, I hear you, Secretary Pompeo, I hear you, John Bolton, but I now need to make the next step of a small concession for my friend Kim Jong-un if I'm going to convince him to keep going down this path toward denuclearization. Because Kim Jong-un and Trump are writing letters back and forth. And apparently, according to Kim's reading of the Trump letter, it is a step-by-step process. So that's how at least Kim wants to interpret it. I think Trump's team would say, no, it's not step-by-step, small steps. It's some big steps have to be coming in the next year or two. And this would be Kim's miscalculation, that if he does not take some meaningful, serious steps that experts would consider a serious step back from their nuclear missile programs, there is no way the United States government, forget about President Trump, is going to be able to support meaningful sanctions relief. So if Kim really wants sanctions relief, he's going to have to do something serious.
Mm-hmm. And this week, a U.S. think tank has released another undisclosed North Korean missile base. And South Korean media points out that U.S. and South Korean intelligence already knows about these places. So releasing of these informations, how does this help the current negotiations?
Well, it doesn't help the negotiations one way or the other. I think there's a healthy skepticism in Washington about whether or not North Korea will ever truly denuclearize. And these kinds of reports that come out periodically from well-regarded and reputable think tanks like CSIS, they're chronicling a portion of what the North has been up to with their nuclear weapons and missile programs. This is no surprise to anyone. And I think what I object to is just the implication that somehow North Korea has deceived us and on the one hand promised to denuclearize and on the other hand is proceeding with missile development. North Korea has not promised to halt their advancement of missiles. When they do, then if they are deceiving us, we should criticize them. But for the moment, they're just doing what we have known them to be doing for decades. And it's not a surprise to anyone who's been well informed on this program.
And Sweden has invited members of the six-party talks for a conference in spring. Do you envision this current U.S.-North Korea talks quickly expanding into the multilateral talks?
There are geopolitical implications for the future of Northeast Asia that will necessarily involve all of the major powers around the Korean Peninsula, including the two Koreas. So at some point, yes, there needs to be some six-party talks, but it would be fanciful to think that those six-party talks can somehow replace the need for the bilateral discussions or even the trilateral discussions between the two Koreas, or between two Koreas and the United States, talking about denuclearization and peace. So ultimately, those three parties are going to have to come up with the terms of reference for meaningful peace and denuclearization, but six parties can definitely help reinforce, help watch, monitor, help support that process if it gets going.
You know, a dozen years ago, the last time we really had six-party talks, I mean, it's hard to imagine, but it's really about 12 years ago. The international community was frankly more in alignment on North Korea than it is today. If you look at the state of U.S.-China relations, U.S.-Russia relations, South Korea-Japan relations, there's been a deterioration in the great power relationships. The Korean Peninsula has both the potential to help repair some of those relationships by providing a focus for common interest, but it also still has the potential to further disrupt those great power relationships as well. So I hope at some point the six-party talks may reconvene and that it might help to forge more of a sense of community in Northeast Asia on a common goal. But I think we're a long way from that right now, and I think it's unlikely that those talks are going to meaningfully enhance Northeast Asian community in the near future.
And some critics argue that North Korea is taking advantage of the United States in the summitry. So how can we prevent this from happening in the second summit?
Well, North Korea is inclined and built to take advantage of everybody, I think, in terms of the system that they have. The best way to protect yourself in summit meetings is to pre-negotiate. This was the lesson of Henry Kissinger and the many summits that he helped prepare Nixon and other presidents with the Soviet leaders. And that is, if you pre-negotiate the specific concessions and terms of reference, the leaders can come together and ratify that, get credit for it, get the blame for it. They can go beyond it, but at least they know what the minimum agreement already is. That's the best way to assure it. The first summit can be forgiven as an icebreaker, I think, and I've supported the president's idea to break the ice with Kim and to do something bold and different. But for a second summit, I really think he needs to throttle back and just hold off until Secretary Pompeo, Special Representative Began have a couple of specific, meaningful steps in place that can then lead to the next step of negotiation.
Well, we've got a president here, I mean, I hate to say this, but we've got a U.S. president who's famous for making deals and breaking them. So I think there's plenty of mistrust to go on this process on both sides. We've got a U.S. president who hires contractors and doesn't pay them. So if I'm Kim Jong-un, I'm going into this process with both eyes open. I sure hope that President Trump is as well, because we wouldn't need to have these kinds of high-level talks with North Korea if we had a lot of trust. We're having them precisely because there is mistrust between the parties, and we're trying step by step to build some kind of relationship.
So should we delay the second summit if the preparatory work is not really done before then, the end of February?
Yes, we should. I think there's no point in having a second summit that doesn't yield meaningful, concrete steps toward denuclearization. There's no rush, and if we cannot agree those steps in advance, I would recommend postponing until you get that agreement.
One of the tactics, by the way, is to use the deadline of a forthcoming summit to force action. But if that action is not going to be forthcoming, delay it, postpone it. We postpone things all the time. Meetings can be easily postponed. So the president should definitely keep his powder dry if North Korea has not given us enough to negotiate.
So we'll end our discussion here and watch video for our next discussion. Special Representative Began has a newly designated counterpart. Mr. Kim Hyok-chol is believed to be this new counterpart, who was former ambassador to Spain and worked on disarmament issues at the North Korean mission in Geneva. So Frank, why did Pyongyang bring in this new working level official at this point in negotiations?
It's always hard to interpret North Korean diplomatic moves such as this with personnel changes, but I think the signal that may be sent here is that by sending an arms control specialist to be Began's representative counterpart, rather than a North American Affairs America specialist like Madam Che, I think you're seeing potentially a move toward a new phase in the U.S.-DPRK working level relationship, where the North Koreans are going to assign personnel with the right background and skill set to either accelerate the denuclearization process or, as necessary, slow it down. But they really are sending a message, I think, here that the shift of focus now is from the relationship ice-breaking that Patrick referenced to the particulars of nuclear disarmament. And potentially that's a good sign.
Patrick, how do you see it? What does this mean for Special Representative Began?
And I agree with Frank that this is probably to try to provide technical expertise at the table, whether it's for good or ill. We'll see what the results are. For Special Representative Steve Biegun, I think he and other officials inside the Trump administration have seen a change inside Pyongyang over the last 2 or 3 months, where the foreign ministry has been further downgraded in its role in the negotiations. So this was signaled coming for the last several weeks, not just this last week, according to officials talking to me. And I believe that this is about control of the part of intelligence community within inside Pyongyang over the foreign ministry, because we're talking about negotiating the crown jewels of North Korea's nuclear weapons program. That's not something you want to have diplomats in charge of from Pyongyang's vantage point. So I think this is about control over the very, very sensitive issues of nuclear missile programs. It's no longer just niceties of diplomats getting together. That could be a good sign, but it also is an interesting sign.
Just to underscore this last point Patrick made, on some of my visits to North Korea, where I've interacted with Madam Che and members of the foreign ministry, I've been struck by the fact that they have often been denied access by North Korea to the details about North Korea's own nuclear program. When I visited Yongbyon, it was the first time in the company of a North Korean diplomat, first time that North Korean diplomat had a chance to visit Yongbyon, even though they had been negotiating about Yongbyon for years. So this represents, I think, partly the division of labor inside the North Korean government.
And if you want to pull a lesson out of the U.S.-Soviet arms control negotiation, the Soviet Union got upset when American negotiators were introducing secrets that Soviet diplomats did not have access to or were not cleared for. So you could even see the intelligence community inside Pyongyang saying, hey, get the foreign ministry away from this. This is too sensitive even for them.
Now, you two have moved on to the topic that I wanted to move on to, and both of you have background in intelligence, right?
I
Yes.
do, from the State Department.
So Secretary Pompeo was first at CIA, and that's when, before the first summit, the CIA and the United Front Department actually arranged for the first summit. But now that Secretary Pompeo has moved to the State Department and he's the lead negotiator, what is the current role of CIA and UFD?
Well, look, sensitive diplomatic missions have often been undertaken by people other than official diplomats. If you go back to the time of the Nixon administration opening to China, the State Department was largely sidelined from that process that was run by the National Security Council and Henry Kissinger. If you look at the North-South rapprochement efforts under Kim Dae-jung, the lead person was Lim Dong-hwan, the head of the Korean intelligence agencies, who was the envoy to the North. So there is a track record here. Why? It's partly because the intelligence agencies are better at keeping secrets than the foreign ministries are. It's sometimes the fact that personal relationships matter, and the trust between the top leader and the official that they are dispatching for these sensitive missions. But I think it's neither unprecedented nor is it inappropriate that the intelligence communities would be playing an important liaison role here. And I think it speaks to the seriousness with which both governments are approaching this initiative.
And Patrick, when the two intelligence officials meet to arrange for an important diplomatic event, would they also try to glean information from each other?
Well, I would hope so. I mean, an Indian intelligence officer worth his salt or her salt is trying to figure out what the other side is thinking, get inside their head, find out what else information that we don't already know that they have. Good luck finding that out from intelligence professionals. But I think there's a certain professional respect as well. And I think this is the aim here. That is, if you can have somebody who really knows the secrets of the other side and the fears of the other side, get together and say, look, we honestly want to try to ratchet down this tension. We know it's going to be difficult. We know you don't trust us and we don't trust you, and you know a lot about us and we know a lot about you, but we're going to make this happen. And we're going to do it secretly. We're not going to break this out into the news program every night. And I think that wins the respect of, unfortunately, a dictatorship of Kim Jong-un. But that's what has to happen at this point if we're going to have some kind of a breakthrough toward a more peaceful peninsula.
Let me point out one other factor that may be at play here, which is that remember that there is no U.S. embassy in Pyongyang, there's no North Korean embassy in Washington. When the U.S. reached out to China through intelligence channels, or when the North and South communicate, the absence of embassies and ambassadors is also one of the reasons why the foreign ministries tend to have a subordinate role. When Ambassador Mike Mansfield sat in his office in Tokyo, President Carter, President Reagan didn't need to go through their intelligence agencies to get a high-level message to the Japanese leadership. They went to Mike Mansfield. But we have no ambassador in Sweden, in Pyongyang. We have no ambassador there. They don't have an ambassador here. So I think there's a bureaucratic element to this that should not be overlooked.
Well, we'll leave it here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment. Time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today, we have a screenshot of North Korea's propaganda website, 우리 민족끼리. The title of this TV discussion is North Korea is Heaven for People, where Jesus will have no work to do. The program contends the society that Jesus wants is full of brotherly love, and North Korea is indeed family-like society where nobody have to worry about survival. Frank, what's your take?
Well, I'm struck that there would be this comparison of a sort of a religious ideal to life inside North Korea. I think most people who live there would not necessarily agree with this assessment about the idyllic life in North Korea, but it also speaks to the confidence in North Korean broadcasting to their own people about the kind of society that Kim Jong-un is trying to build. He has a vision, this heaven on earth vision for the people of North Korea in the future, and he wants to communicate that dream to them. Good luck getting there.
Well, I guess I take a less favorable view even, that this is somewhat of a secular conceit of a dictatorship toward religious freedom. They have no idea what religious freedom is about and why people care about their souls and about faith, and to kind of dismiss all of that by saying, look, we're providing all of this is pretty rich.
Well, on that note, we'll leave it here. Patrick?
Thank you.
Frank? Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.